Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Super Coach Mate. Well, unfortunately, the grand final was very one-sided, to say the least. So well done to Brisbane. I think very deserving premiers, which we'll get to in a sec on why I think they're very deserving premiers. So as per usual, I am joined by Thomas. How was your weekend, Thomas? Obviously, we were at the game together. How was the
Yeah,
experience?
yeah, no, really good. Yeah, it was a good game, good experience. Or not, let me rephrase that. Not good game for the neutrals, but a good experience overall. It was my first time going live to a grand final. I've worked a few myself, back in the day at the G, but watching it live as a patron is a different experience altogether. I think I told you off on the day. It's a game aside. I think it doesn't really matter what the outcome is, especially picking a team as well. Like Lions jumping on the bandwagon for the last couple weeks makes it a little bit more enjoyable. But I think adding the pre-game as well as all the stuff that goes around it and the hype that builds up towards the day, I think is definitely an enjoyable experience that anyone that can experience it for sure in your lifetime. But moving on to this episode, what we're going to be going through is kind of a preview, or not preview, a review of the grand final. Go through a few of the stats, go through a couple of the players that flunked it or did really well. We'll touch on one player in particular who I think will be a really important name come Supercoach in 2025. And then moving on to the next couple of weeks leading into off season, we're going to be doing a bit of a wash up on a couple teams that we haven't done yet. Obviously, we did a bit of the teams with different content creators already, but we'll touch on those other teams that we haven't touched on at all as the weeks progress in the month of October. But moving on to Nath's stats that matter. So obviously, Nathan's been pretty top on this sort of stuff, done a really good job analysing the stats. He's actually been pretty spot on from when we've actually reflected on it after the game. But as we head into the last game or review the last game of the year, how did the Lions and the Swans stats match up to what you predicted moving into this game, Nath?
Basically to a T. It matched up pretty much perfectly with what the last premiers have done. So Brisbane on Saturday won the inside 50 battle. As we touched on, 11 of 11 premiers won the inside 50 battle, so that's now 12 of 12. Brisbane won the turnover battle by, what's that, 7.5 goals. Again, 11 of 11 on grand final day, so that's now 12 of 12 on grand final day. I did flag this actually last week. I felt like the game, because both of these sides are more of a control game. I know we spoke about the 3 of the last 15 grand finals. Only 3 of the last 15 grand finals have been had more marks and grand balls. But I did flag when we did our preview one. I felt like that this might be a high marking game, and that was obviously the case. Brisbane took 158 marks. And Sydney only took 88. So Brisbane basically just disarmed Sydney across the field. But I think the thing that would really, I guess, frustrate John Longmire is the fact that Sydney had their worst performance of the year from a pressure perspective on the big stage. So most teams try and average about 180 for a game. There was not one quarter where Sydney got above 160. And 160 is considered poor as a pressure rating. So the fact that they were below that for the whole game just showed how much Brisbane disarmed them. And then when Brisbane had more disposal, but their pressure was above AFL average. I think it was about 186. But when it really mattered in that second quarter, when they kicked away, it was well over 200. So, yeah. So I guess, yeah, for Brisbane, they thoroughly deserved their win, and they were able to put pressure on Sydney, and Sydney were not able to handle it. And people have been telling me for the last 2 years that Brisbane can't play on the MCG. And I mean, I think that can now get dispelled. I think the best 2 games that they've played in the last 2 years have both been on the MCG, which was last year's grand final, and then obviously what we saw on Saturday. So I think that thing can go out the window now. I think it's more so now whether or not Sydney can play the MCG, given that their game plan seemed to just get completely disarmed. They couldn't deal with the wide space of the ground, which was surprising because I actually thought it might help them more with their kicking, but they just were constantly forced into turnover. And we spoke about we spoke about the scores from turnover in the preview one, and it basically matched to a T. So well done to Brisbane, fully deserving premiers. They were the only team who ranked. They were the only team who ranked in the top 2. So they were one of only 2 teams who ranked top 6. In all 5 of those areas that we touched on in the stats that matter across the whole season. They were only one of 2 teams. And the other team we'll get to when we do our preview podcast, but it might be a bit of a surprise. I still am collating all of it together, but I do have the all the differentials across the year. So basically what your team did versus what they gave up. I have that in front of me. I just have to get the individual team sort of matchups and see where they're all at. But Brisbane were top 2 in all 5 of the categories. So contested possession, clearance, inside 50, scores from clearance, and scores from turnover differential. Top 2 in all 5. So very deserving premier from a stats perspective.
Yeah, no, I think you bang on with your stats, and I think we'll look in those stats in a lot more detail as we look into each team's wash up and how that correlates to their season and what they need to do to get back in premiership contention in 2025, and also how that links into Supercoach, because I guess stats played a massive part into Supercoach, and we always say that you can look at the eye test and how those players go on TV, but stats is a whole nother realm of possibilities as well if you can nail that down and analyze them effectively. But moving on to the player of the match, I know both of us are probably going to agree on this one. The Norm Smith medalist in Will Ashcroft. It was both our bets when we were kind of thinking who was going to win it. There was a couple like, Lockie Neal is an obvious candidate there, Cal Archie kicking 4 goals, and what's the guy's name? Kai Lohman, the young kid from Brizzy as well, kicking 4 goals and a half. He did really well. But Ashcroft is just one of those players I think he's going to be like this for the rest of the career until Neal and Dunkley retire, where he's never going to be, he might get a bit more attention come next year, but he was always get question mark coming back from an ACL injury and how that knee would hold up. But he's just moved in seamlessly into that midfield, just goes about his business, does it really effectively, almost like a Neil prototype in the fact that he just racks up disposals very clean by foot. And he's young as well and is quick as well, which makes it hard to take. But 30 disposals, 5 marks, 1 goal, and 128 Supercoach points. I think he racked up a ton as well in the previous final. I don't know about the one before that, but actually quite well as well. So what do you think, Nathan? Is he one, or first of all, how did you like his game? And second of all, do you reckon he is someone that we should seriously consider come 2025 Supercoach? Would he be a lock in your side, classic-wise?
I'm not sure about a classic. I'm not. Unfortunately, I'm not sure about classic. For Will Ashcroft. But hang on. I'm just trying to get the Oh, here we go. This is what I'm looking for. Perfect. So, I probably wouldn't be going near him in classic.
Mm-hmm.
I say that with obviously a little bit of trepidation, but I believe that Brisbane are going to draft his brother,
Yes.
who is being touted as another number 1 draft pick. So, Brisbane just have a riches of talent at the minute. Which when we get to their wash up, you'll probably start seeing why I know every premier they say a dynasty premiership, but yeah, the stats that Brisbane have put out over the last 2 years, if they can maintain that, which I guess is always the challenge as a reigning premier, is maintaining the rage. But if they can maintain what they've done, they will be right up there again next year. But yeah, it's interesting. So you actually have a look at the player ratings. So the champion data player rating points. And they actually had Lachie Neale as the number 1 rated player on the ground, ahead of Will Ashcroft, which I wasn't surprised at, given that Neale did finish with 35 disposals. But I guess the Norm Smith votes were unanimous. So yeah, I from a super coach perspective, I'm probably not going to go near him. But if he's reasonably priced, which I think he probably will be, given the fact he only played 6 or 7 games this year, on a comeback trail. But yeah, I think for me, there's always, I guess, a trepidation in picking premiership players. Just because you don't know how they're going to rebound the next year. I mean, we saw with Collingwood. Basically, you know, I was hot on Degoe, but he sort of didn't turn up in the preseason, and then he obviously got injured. I was having a bit of a sniff at Tom Mitchell as well, but he obviously didn't play as well. So, yeah, I think for me, a lot of these Brisbane players are probably going to be wait and see how they go over preseason.
Yeah.
But yes, I think he was probably the man of the match in my opinion. I know the player ratings say that Neale was, and that's perfectly fine. But I just felt like that when the game was there to be won, it was this guy, Will Ashcroft, leading from the front, which is amazing given that he's only 20 and a half years old. And he's probably already Brisbane's close to, if not their most important player. Given that the fact that they probably sorely missed him in last year's grand final. He could have made a massive difference in last year's grand final as well. So in some ways, I'm glad that him and Brisbane sort of got their redemption from last year. But yeah, I think he's going to be a massive player going forward, and I think sides might actually have a look at him as being a tag instead of Lachie Neale, just because of what he can do with the ball.
Yeah, no, I do agree in that sense. He feels like a kid that, as talented as he is, might cop a bit of attention now. He's made himself name on the biggest stage possible, and whether he treats that attention well or he suffers from it's another question mark. And I guess you could easily pick him, as you said, he's probably going to be a discount price from what his output probably is because of his limited game time this season. But I guess it's a wait and see with how he does deal with that attention. His obviously brother's going to come in. Arguably, he's better than Levi's better than Will from all reports. So it could be a very dangerous midfield coming to the fray. And as you said, even with Neale looking at retirement in the next couple of years, and when he exits the building for the Lions, they've got a very good midfield setting up, and that dynasty term sometimes gets thrown around a little bit loosely around premiership teams, but the Lions is one that's definitely watch out for the future, because it wasn't only Ashcroft that was missing for majority of that season. They had guys like Kitty Coleman, Duday, Link McCarthy as a solid names on that injury list that come in, and it makes it even much more of a better team. But yeah, one to watch definitely come preseason next season, and how he bounces back from a premiership winning side to Supercoach in 2025. But let's move on to our top 5 most disappointing players and top 5 most impressive players, as basically the scoreline suggests. The top 5 disappointing players are pretty much all Sydney Swans players. You could make a case for some Lions players being a little bit quiet, but I think as a whole, the Lions deserve all the credit they get. But this is also based on some Supercoach points that were that were recorded on the day. So I put this together last night. Nath, you can agree and disagree and put your 2 cents worth as well, having watched the game live together. But yeah, Joel Amati, 21 Supercoach points, was basically non-existent, as was Hayden McLean, 30 Supercoach points. Tom Papley obviously scored that goal in the first quarter, just really got shot out of it as well. Chad Warner, I think, would be disappointed in his game, considering how well he played in that 2022 grand final. Was pretty much the only player that could hold his head up high. But yeah, this game just really didn't impact the scoreboard as well. I don't know if Heaney's injury meant that he just really suffered with having someone else there in the midfield to help him out. And Brodie Grundy, I know he scored 129 Supercoach points there. So as an owner, the Supercoach should be thrilled with that score. But if you look deeper, and we both saw it live, he played against Darcy Fort, and I know Oscar McInerney came out and said in a press conference that Darcy Fort was, smashing down the door of VFL level. So on a good day where both are fit, you could argue the case for both players to play in that grand final side regardless of injury. But just looking at a player like Grundy, who they're paying top dollar for, I think really should have done more around the ground. His disposals really weren't that impactful. I think he had like 7 turnovers or something like that as well. So just should really have made himself prominent on the big stage and got the first hit out to advantage to his Swans midfielders. I think really lack there. And I think that's a big problem with Grundy in general. He just doesn't make the most of it when he does come up against weaker opposition or opposition he should dominate, which is frustrating as an owner in a regular season of Supercoach. What are your thoughts there, Nathan? I know one player that you probably might want to touch on is Logan McDonald, but I know he was basically not able to run for the majority of the week, so you're probably going to be a bit nice on him, and he probably shouldn't have played. But is there any other players that really didn't step it up for the Swans?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting going through all the stats from the game. So you've got that up there. So I'm actually going to go through now the player rating stats and tell you who Champion Data had as the most disappointing. So they actually agreed that Joel Amati was the worst player on the ground. His player rating for the game was minus 0.6, which on grand final day you can't be doing that. Logan McDonald they had as the second worst. Will Haywood they had as the third worst. Hayden McLean's the fourth, and Charlie Cameron they actually had as the fifth worst, which might actually surprise a few people. But yeah, unfortunately for Charlie, he had, I think he had three. He kicked 1 goal, 2. But to be fair, the player rating system really does, I guess, hurt you if you're not accurate in front of goal, which unfortunately Charlie Cameron wasn't. It's hard to argue with Joel Amati being the worst player. Hayden McLean being there as well. Tom Papley. So we're all seeing a common thread here, and that is that the whole Sydney forward line basically just got completely shut out of the game. So I mean, you've got You've got Amati, McLean, Papley. So you've got 3 of Sydney's forwards, and Champion Data have 4 of Sydney's forwards as being the worst 4 players on the ground. The one I will disagree with you is Brodie Grundy. I feel like he can hold his head high. I know people were probably expecting more from him, given that he was rucking against Darcy Fort. But I realistically don't think there's much more that he could have done on grand final day to keep Sydney in that game. The only slight criticism I will have is that in that 20-minute block when Brisbane took the game and basically ripped it away from Sydney, he did get outpointed a few times by Danaher and Darcy Fort. So when the game was slipping away, he did perhaps he wasn't as effective as probably what he would like to be. But outside of that, I think he can really hold his head high. He's actually the highest rated player for Sydney on the day. I know the player ratings don't mean everything. There is more that sort of meets the eye. And Chad Warner, I think, he'd probably be disappointed after his grand final of 2022. I actually thought he might win the Norm Smith if Sydney won the game, which was, very disappointing that he didn't fire perhaps as well as he should have done. He started off okay, but another one where, unfortunately, when Brisbane started getting on top, he just fell out of the game, and couldn't do anything. And the other one, I'm surprised you haven't actually mentioned him on here, is Isaac Heaney. I'm
Yeah.
surprised you haven't actually put him on here. So champion data 678. So champion data had him as the 8th worst player on the ground. Unfortunately for Isaac, he had just, let me get it up now. He only had 13 disposals. But I think of those 13 disposals, I think 6 of them were clangers. Which is basically gifting the ball straight back to the opposition. I know at one stage he had 12 disposals and 5 of them were clangers. And I know Sydney have come out and said that he had a stress fracture. But I'm not really buying that. I'm not buying that excuse from Sydney because if he's had it the whole final series, then why was he perfect 10 in the first final and the third final when both coaches gave him their as the best player on the ground, and then all of a sudden they lose and now he's got a stress fracture. So yes, it might have been legit, but I don't think that's the way to approach losing a grand final by 10 goals, by saying, well, our best player had a stress fracture. And yeah, I think I think you could just about put the whole Sydney team in here, to be honest, and probably Charlie Cameron, as harsh as that sounds. But yes, I do agree with you. This whole Sydney forward line's probably the top 5 most disappointing, to be honest. And then Sydney Stars just didn't fire. I mean, even Gordon, he was only rated 6.7. He was sort of only mid table, sort of just below average. Which, yeah, it was just a complete mauling.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I think, Swans probably really have to look, and we'll touch on this later on in the episode with regards to what has gone wrong with their grand final performances. They've competed in 4, lost all 4, and just really been embarrassed on the bigger stage. Their players don't show up. You know, how many more excuses are you going to give them? And we both agreed on the fact that Dane Rampion, his post-game speech on stage, when they asked the captain to come up and speak, he just looked a broken man. I don't know. It takes all the guts, obviously, come up and speak after being humiliated on the bigger stage, but just I don't think he knew what to say to the players and the playing group. And I think it's going to be very hard for them to regroup. I wouldn't be surprised if players start walking out the door and finding success elsewhere, because I think they're just really craving that ultimate success. They've been so dominant for so many years.
And I will just quickly touch on this as well. I know when we do the wash up, I'm going to talk about this again, but I wouldn't be saying Sydney are shooing next year, because historically sides who get destroyed in grand finals like Sydney did historically don't bounce back the next year. Just I'll go through it in more detail when we do the wash up on the Swans, but just temper your expectation on Sydney next year, because history says they're probably not going to have a good year next year.
Yeah, and I think it's almost doubled down that fact with regards to being smashed in 2 grand finals in 3 years is pretty hard to deal with. But moving on to the flip side of the thing, the best players on the ground, I think you could lay a blanket over a number of Brisbane Lions players that did a superb job. Based off the ranking points, as a big consideration, what Ashcroft won the Norm Smith medal. Just went about his business and just dominated in around the ground, just so clean in regards to getting the football and moving it forward. I think he's a big reason why their corridor football works so well. It's just someone like a Dacos where he can just flick the handball out and get the ball going. Lachie Neale, 149 Supercoach points. I think he is someone that we got to seriously discuss next year's season. What happens now that, potentially, I know that they moved the tag off Neale and moved it to Ashcroft. And does that actually help Neale? And does that mean that Neale becomes even more of a Supercoach pig? That Ashcroft might get more attention, because you look at Ashcroft and Neale, doesn't matter who you put the tag on, they're both going to do pretty well. Cal Archie had a really impressive game, really liked his game. When Danaher was quiet, he was the one that was up and about playing that crucial kind of centre half forward, high half forward role, kicking 4 goals. Kai Lohman, he's one that I think he was a rookie this year, and a lot of people just didn't really think he was been the best 22, was a sub risk. He's rubber stamped his credentials as almost their number one key forward outside of Cameron, key small forward, sorry, outside Cameron is almost, I spoke to Nathan about this on grand final day, is almost like the Ginnivan of Hawthorn, just provides that real nasty X factor that any defender would hate coming up against him. He uses the ball very well, just has a massive goal threat, and I think he just lifts up the Brisbane forward line immensely. And Josh Dunkley, I think, should be applauded for his efforts on Heaney. I know Heaney came into that game underdone, but Dunkley has a habit of really nullifying some of the best midfielders in the game, not necessarily as a heavy tagger, but also in the fact that he can bounce back the other way and really damage opposition midfielders. Even though he's doing a defensive midfield role, he does it to perfection. Is there anyone else that missed out on there, Nathan, or you think that lines up pretty well with the stats you got there?
No, they line up pretty well. All 5 of them are in the top 10 of the top 10 player rating players on the ground. So I'll just quickly go through the top 5. So again, this is champion data. So they had Neil, Ashcroft, Grundy, Rowbottom, and Fox as the top 5 on the ground. And then they had Parker, Lohman, Archie, Dunkley, and McCluggage as the top 10. All 5 of them were in the top 10. I mean, you could have thrown a raffle over it, to be honest. And then the next 4 players are all Brisbane players as well. Brisbane had 10 of the top 14 players who were rated on the ground, which is always going to be, hard for them not to win the game with that. I think all of them probably hit the nail. The one I was happy for was actually Jared Berry. I know he just missed out on the top 10. He was number 11. But I know he blamed himself immensely for last year's grand final loss when he gave away the 250-metre penalties.
Oh, yeah.
Which the side bottom goal was one of those. And I know that he sort of put his hand up after the game and said, "I'll take responsibility for that," which must have really stung at him. So for him to put in the performance like he did on Saturday and basically banish all of last year's, heartache, probably really just sums up the way that Brisbane had. I think they had unfinished business, as Alistair Nicholson said after the prelim final. I think they just had unfinished business this year. It's still hard to believe that just 2 weeks ago they were down by more than 7 goals in the semi-final, and now they're lifting a premiership cup. It's also hard to believe that they were 2-5, I think, at the start of the year, and they've won 14 of their last 16 games to win the premiership. And one of those losses was to Collingwood, which, just putting it out there, I know Brisbane couldn't give 2 shits because they've obviously just won the premiership. But I will just say again that just riding the Collingwood high horse, that yes, we did beat Brisbane in the last 4 weeks of the year. But yeah, I think, as I said, we'll touch on in the wash-up, and I briefly touched on, but it's hard to fault from a stats perspective. Brisbane this year, they were probably the most even team. As I said, I haven't got the full data set in front of me, so I can't definitively confirm what I've got in front of me, but their differentials read just 1-1, 2-2, 2. Which is basically where you want to be. And then they're number 1 in the most important stat, which is the scores from turnover, which, again, when we do the wash-up, there's a few reality checks for a couple of big teams in here about how they can get in the premiership window, including a certain black and red team who need to basically... figure out how to do this, because this is what's holding them back, and it's probably cost them finals the last 2 years. And no, it's not your team, Thomas. It's not St Kilda. Just to get you thinking it's St Kilda, but it's not. They're actually not too bad at this turnover stuff. But yeah, it's hard to fault Brisbane and the year they had from a statistical and a number perspective. They're just about the perfect team across the whole year. And yeah, let's see where they go from here.
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting to see whether they bounce back or have another disaster start to the year, but I don't think that will happen again based off how well they finished off this season. But yeah, top 4 grand final takeaways. I think the first one off the bat we got to address is what's wrong with the Swans in grand finals. We obviously look at the last 4 grand finals. They lost in the 2016 one against the Dogs. They got humiliated by the Cats, and we all thought, surely not. We don't want this to happen again. There's no way Sydney are going to get embarrassed. We know how proud their culture is, and they got absolutely romped against the Lions in a game that pretty much was over after quarter time. We obviously looked at the first quarter and said, hey, it's going to be a really enthralling encounter. It's goal for goal. But after that, Brisbane just put their foot in the accelerator and literally looked at times like a training drill. What do you think's wrong with them in grand finals? Is it a mentality thing? Is there something structurally wrong? Is it players not buying in? Because you look at their seasons as a whole, and they obviously do superbly well to get there in the first place, but just something falls apart when it comes to the last day in September, or last Saturday in September, and they just absolutely crumble because it's getting to a point now. We both made a joke about it on Saturdays. You pretty much, if Sydney's playing a grand final, you may as well not rock up to watch it because they're pretty rubbish. What are your thoughts on that one, Nath?
Well, it's hard to actually pinpoint what goes wrong with Sydney in grand finals. To be honest with you, because I don't think it's the ground. So I don't think it's actually like a game style issue. I know that perhaps I mentioned that earlier on, but yeah, the MCG is only 2.5 meters longer and 2.5 meters wider than the SCG, and you can't tell me that 2.5 meters is going to make a massive difference on the way that a team plays. So as in the SCG's the SCG is 156 meters long and the MCG is 160 meters long. So it's 4 centimeters. So it's 4 meters shorter. And then the SCG is 136 meters from wing to wing, and the MCG is 141. So you can't possibly tell me that 2 meters either goal and 2.5 meters out on the wing is the reason why they've struggled in grand finals. So it's got to be something else. And I know Chris Fagan actually spoke about this last year, where he felt like that Brisbane didn't prepare themselves as best as they could. They got here late. They sort of didn't soak in the feeling of the grand final. And then this year you hear Chris Fagan speak after the game, and you look all throughout the week, they had all their players went to the media. I know Dunkley went on AFL 360. I think they had some players go on. I know Chris Fagan was on Talking Footy with JB and Trent Cotchin and Selwood on Wednesday night. So they really embraced the week, whereas Sydney once again didn't get here till Thursday, and they sort of approached the game of, and we've got unfinished business here, whereas Brisbane sort of more embraced the week and what it means. And I think that really helped Brisbane acclimatise and settle, because it is, unless you're in Melbourne, it's really hard to actually sort of, I guess, sell to an interstate listener what grand final week is like in Melbourne. There's just a buzz about being in Melbourne for grand final week. And I feel like the way that Brisbane did it, they got here on the Wednesday, they basically just opened up themselves to the media and said, as long as we can make it, we'll be there. Whereas Sydney seemed to sort of shy away from all of that, which perhaps has hurt them in the end. They didn't get here till Thursday. And then the whole issue of playing underdone players. So I know Brisbane will have said they had players. I think Neil's ankle was basically hanging halfway off his foot after the game. But you didn't hear Chris Fagan use that as an excuse as to why he, didn't do as well, or you didn't hear Chris Fagan say, oh, Neil's under an injury cloud, so he might not do as well. Whereas you heard that from Sydney, basically, as soon as the game was done. Heaney wasn't right, McDonald wasn't right. So I just think the way that Brisbane approached this grand final and the way Sydney approached the grand final were two very contrasting ways. And I wouldn't be surprised because I noticed that what Brisbane did as well, they used a lot of messages. Like I don't know if you saw, Thomas, on the banner, they had "believe" on the banner.
Yeah.
Which Collingwood did the same thing last year. They had "make it memorable." Actually won, and they they were premiers. They changed up "believe" to "believed." Which Collingwood changed their slogan last year from "make it memorable" to "made it memorable." So I don't know if Chris Fagan has, and I'm not taking any credit away from Chris Fagan because obviously there's only so much that he can, there's only so much that outside help can do. But I just wonder if Chris Fagan perhaps had a chat with McRae and Lepage about last year. And they've sort of linked on those messages to get them through the final series, which again is perfectly okay. You're allowed to do it. And the other reason why I think perhaps it may have worked is because obviously McRae and Fagan were old Brisbane players as well. So I'm sure that even though, they're at Collingwood now and they're starting, they still have that Brisbane blood in them. So, of course, they want to see them do really well. So I wouldn't be surprised if Fagan actually tapped into those two about, what they did last year and, what they did to, I guess, motivate and inspire the players. But yeah, the other thing I think went wrong with Sydney is, once again, they lost the game before it even mattered. I'm not going to elaborate too much, but I'll talk about that more in number 4. But I feel like, once again, Sydney lost the grand final before it even got played. So again, I'll elaborate more about why in number 4. But I just think that they lost it on, in the middle of the week with the planning and how they prepared for the week. You can't be losing games before they've even started. So, that's sort of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. You look at Sydney's excuses and then, you just wonder as a Swan supporter why Mills probably didn't play. I know, probably just wasn't quite right. I know he passed the fitness test and all that, but they probably didn't feel like it was necessary. But I think it just feels at times they're really lacking that strong leadership from internally, from the playing group as well. I know they're a really proud club, but yeah, as you said, you just list off a whole bunch of reasons. I think they all correlate pretty effectively to what, Swanee says something internally wrong that really need to fix up and really try and bounce back in 2025. But speaking on the flip side, do you reckon the Lions, and we'll keep this one a bit shorter because we've obviously touched on a little bit of it already, but do you reckon the Lions can go back to back? I know a lot of teams struggle to bounce back after winning a premiership. You look at Richmond, they went in a three-peat. You look at the Brisbane Lions back in that 0-2, 3-4. Oh, sorry. They got 2 in a row, didn't they?
Yeah, they got 3 or 4.
Yeah, 2 in a row. But yeah, they obviously were a force to be reckoned with in that period. But do you reckon the Lions can do it again, or do you reckon it's more of a case that you look at where the Lions came from to win that premiership, it's more of anyone can win it on any given day, or do you reckon the Lions are pretty much strong favourites moving into 2025?
Well, I know I'm just putting it out there, so I guess you can take my word with a grain of salt. But if you ask anyone in my household, after Collingwood won the grand final last year, I didn't think about back-to-back. I just thought, let's just get to preliminary final week and go from there, because anything can happen on preliminary final night. And then grand finals are just a one-off event where weird things happen, like what happened on Saturday, where Hipwood basically kicked probably the best goal he's ever going to kick, and then pull out the Ackermann celebration. So realistically, I know David King and Daniel Hoyne, so obviously you've probably heard of David King from SEN, Fox Footy, and then Daniel Hoynes from Champion Data. So they don't talk about making a grand final. They talk about making preliminary finals. And the way that Brisbane play the game, I think they are every chance of getting back to a preliminary final night. And then once you get to preliminary final night, anything can happen on preliminary final night. With the way that they play, I think they've got the biggest home ground advantage in the AFL. The way that they play, I think can dispel that MCG myth in that it doesn't stand up on the MCG, because it absolutely does stand up on the MCG. I think it's more who Brisbane have actually played on the ground as opposed to themselves. I know there might be a few, little tweaks here and there, but I think largely with Brisbane, based on what I've seen, I think it's more who they're playing. Collingwood have been good in that time. Melbourne have been good the last few years. Geelong have always been there and about. Hawthorn have been dominant. Richmond have been dominant. So they're the teams who they've always played on the MCG. So, I think there's that. So I think Brisbane can easily win all their home games again, like they did last year in 2023. And then they've only got to get, what are they going to get? Probably 4 or 5 on the road. And then they're back to top 4 again. And that's ideally where you want to be. I know they won it from 5th, which is full credit to them. I didn't think they could do it. But I think for Brisbane, they definitely probably would like to finish in the top 4 and ideally top 2. So I think they would be banking on winning all 11 home games next year and probably split their away games 50-50, and they'll be there again next year. I think the only way I can't see Brisbane being there again is if they start dropping home games, which, based on what they've done the last 2 years, it's really hard to see them dropping too many home games. So I think they'll be around the mark again next year. But let's not talk about back-to-back. Let's just talk about getting back to a preliminary final night.
Yeah, I think they've got that massive advantage there where, they don't have to worry about so much losing on their home deck. They're a team where, Sydney this year, for example, didn't do so well at the SCG, but the Lions just know how to play that ground ridiculously well. It's obviously a different advantage there, with conditions being a lot more slipperier. They just know how to play that game. And I think their transition into corridor football in that way, they play so effectively to tearing both Sydney and the Cats apart in that second half of the prelim, provides a scary proposition at the Gabba, because obviously Gabba's a bit narrower, plays a lot like Marvel. That could be a very scary transition game moving into 2025. But moving on to the third point there, and this was a bit of a bombshell brought by old mate BT with regards to Danaher retiring. There was some whispers moving into the grand final day that Danaher might call it quits. There's nothing official yet being said. I think it's all on his terms at the moment. I know that it's been reported his family hasn't really suggested that he's going to retire. I know the playing group don't really want him to retire. He provides so much to that team. He's a focal point up forward, similar to Max King of St Kilda. But if Danaher hypothetically does retire, Nath, who fills the void? Because obviously you look at that lineup, you take out Danaher, all of a sudden that forward line doesn't look as scary anymore. But do you think they'll be right if Danaher does decide to call it quits? They've got Logan Morris there. They did play all of Logan Morris, Hipwood and Danaher, and that seems to be working a treat. Do you think that problems might start arising if Danaher does leave? Because we know Hipwood's pretty much a bipolar player in the fact that he can have really hot and cold games. Logan Morris is only young. Link McCarthy probably comes back from an ACL injury. He's a small forward there. You got Zach Bailey, Charlie Cameron, but you take out Joe Danaher, all of a sudden that Brisbane forward line doesn't become so threatening. Who do you think comes into play if Danaher does pull up the boots?
Yeah, well, this is the question mark that I do have over Brisbane, which is why I said let's not talk about back-to-back. Let's just talk about getting back to preliminary final, because if you start thinking about back-to-back, then if it doesn't happen, you're just going to be, disappointed. But yeah, this is the wild card, and this was a bit of a bombshell for me about him considering his retirement. Yes, it will leave a massive hole in their forward line, because I think the last few years he has been their leading goal scorer. But he provides a focal point for, Cameron and Bailey and McCarthy. I know he wasn't there on grand final day. But his focal point allows those smaller players to get to work. And again, as we saw on grand final day, it wasn't really the key forwards who did the damage for Brisbane. It was the small forwards, Lohman. I know he plays sort of like a taller forward, but he'd still be a small forward. Archie, who else kicked some goals on grand final day?
As well.
And Charlie Cameron, and that was it. But yeah, it was Archie and Lohman who did all the damage. And Danaher sort of just complimented them. I know he got, what did he get? 2 goals, 4. Probably should have had 6, to be honest. But yeah, I think it leaves a massive void. And I'm not sure if Hipwood's the answer, because I think sort of towards the back end of the year, I think he was sort of playing more as a defender. Yeah. So I don't know if they've got, maybe if there's any line supporters out there, they might know more than what I do, but I can't think of anyone off the top of my head who could come in and have the same impact as what Joe does. So that is something they are going to have to work on. And yeah, I will just point out as well, I don't know, is this the last slide? Is there
one more, but yeah, pretty much this is it.
Yeah. I will just touch as well that I don't know why this is the case, but no premiership side has ever, no premiership 23 or 22 or whatever it was, has ever lined up in another game again for the rest of, the history of the AFL. So, no premiership side has played another match together with the exact same players. So, there are going to be players who do leave for Brisbane, or would retire. I know Zorko's going ahead again, but yeah, if Danaher does leave, yes, it will leave a massive void.
Yeah, I think it'd be definitely a question mark for their forward line, but I guess we'll wait and find out what Joe Danaher does decide to do. But yeah, the last point there, we'll touch on briefly this because we had a long conversation about Sydney as a general. But yeah, Mills, should he have played or not? Obviously, I believe he did pass that fitness test. He was right to go. You do pick him if he's fit. Or obviously John Longmire didn't, but he was basically available to be picked. I did see footage after the game at halftime. Obviously didn't see it live, but did see that Mills actually came down to the playing group at halftime and did the whole captaincy speech to try and rev them up. I don't know what your thoughts on that is, and it was pretty much showed me how desperate they were to any sort of firepower, any sort of leadership there, because I think they just were completely devoid of confidence. Mills is obviously one of those players that we all know from Supercoach. He's a super hardworking player, one of the best two-way runners in the game. Could have easily gone and tagged Neil and allowed Rowbottom a bit more freedom. I don't know if that would have changed anything, and Mills playing more defensively speaking. I think this is more of a twofold question. First of all, do you think Mills should have played? And second of all, if he should have played, what sort of impact would he have given to that side? And do you think it was enough to kind of swing the favour back into the Swans camp?
Well, I'm just amazed that he didn't play, and yet they played they played Logan McDonald basically in the exact same role that they did. So yeah, as I said, I touched on when we spoke about Sydney going on, but they lost this, for me, they lost this before the game even started. Because I've got a few reasons why. So they didn't play Mills, which I think was a bit of a red flag. I think if he was past fit, they played him, given his importance. Once he wasn't past fit, I don't know why they started Braden Campbell as a sub. I thought he would have been the perfect player to come in and provide them with a bit more run and dash off that half-back line. They played Logan McDonald, who clearly was hampered. But the weird thing about it was they let Harris Andrews just do whatever he wanted. And last year, Craig McRae spoke post-game that, or in fact, he even alluded to this pre-game, but Billy Frampton gets a lot of knocks about his grand final last year when he only had 4 disposals. But he did the most important job, and that is he kept Harris Andrews occupied for 3 quarters. And I would go as far as saying that if Billy Frampton didn't play, then Brisbane, we're probably talking about Brisbane as a back-to-back premiership team. So if Logan McDonald wasn't 100% right, I don't know why he wasn't given that job to literally just play back shoulder on Harris Andrews and just try and nullify his influence. Because you saw in the first half, basically every time Sydney went forward, it would either be Andrews most of the time or Payne who would intercept Mark. And I'll guarantee you now that if that was Collingwood, I'm only speaking on for Collingwood. I'm sure other teams would do the same. But if that was Collingwood, I can guarantee you now that Craig McRae would not have let Harris Andrews have the influence that he had in that first half. So I just think that tactically Sydney went into this game perhaps thinking that they'd already won it. And I think Brisbane really showed them up. I think they talked about what happened 2 years ago, how they felt like they were a young side, which they probably were a young side. They came up against a Geelong side who all the numbers said should have won by as much as they did. But this year was completely different. They sort of, I do have the stats in here with me as now. The one area they still struggle with was contested possession, which they didn't really get showed up with on grand final day. It was only +2 to Brisbane. It wasn't like +40 like it was in 2022. But it's just the way that they played. They just constantly got forced into turnover. And then once Brisbane had the ball, they just let Brisbane play chip mark with the ball all day. And again, I know I'm referencing Collingwood a lot, but I know Craig McRae's spoken about this as well. But you've got to keep Brisbane under 100 uncontested marks for the game, ideally 80. And I think Brisbane had 50, like they were well over 50 at half time. And Sydney just got denied the ball. So I don't know what the planning was for this game. But yeah, this loss will hurt Sydney, and rightly it should, because they were favourites. They had the week off. They didn't have to travel anywhere, and they came up against a side who travelled twice in a row, and they got found wanting once again on the biggest stage. And as I said, the fact they got beaten 2 completely different ways on the same day, I think will be the most alarming stuff. And I know people talk about Collingwood being a generational issue with, winning grand finals, but I think this now is getting to the point where this is generational for Sydney, where they just cannot play on the biggest day in the AFL, which is amazing given the fact that just about, in fact, every player wants to play on that day. But for Sydney, they just got overruled once again. And yeah, I don't know where to from here. They couldn't have had a better year than what they had. Finished on top. They were 11-1 like Collingwood were last year. So I would go as far as saying that Collingwood were a better side last year than what Sydney were this year. And people say Collingwood were one of the worst ever top finishing sides last year. But Collingwood won more games last year than Sydney. They had a better percentage in Sydney last year at the end of the home and away season. And most importantly, they won the premiership last year as well. So I don't know how people can say, Sydney were better than Collingwood last year when all the stats would say they're probably not. So, I just think Sydney, unfortunately, once again lost another grand final before they even played it.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I think, I think the biggest problem that I had with Sydney was just the lack of leadership and ownership they had, regardless of the outcome. They just really struggled to rubber stamp their kind of pause on the grand final. I think they just probably almost looked a little bit arrogant in the fact that they were like, all right, we're the best team all year. We're just going to waltz through this grand final. Brisbane are, potentially a bit exhausted from the whole process. How does it go from here? But I think it was just one of those scenarios where They really showed up on the big stage. I think Mills would have definitely helped them in a leadership category wise because, you got Rampy there as the step-in captain, but other than him, there really isn't anyone to take the reins. They've got quite a young midfield. Their forward line, I think, really needs some consideration in the off-season. I don't think Logan McDonald and Amati are the answer moving forward. You got Hayden McLean playing second ruck, who's actually not too bad, but I think they really need an A-grade midfielder come into the side. And it's a bit ironic as well because I know Joe Danaher was of interest to Sydney and they overlooked him, and they've now really paid big time for their lack of forward pressure that they presented on Saturday. But moving on to, before we wrap it up, just a bit of fun. Obviously, this is my first time at the grand final live. I've seen a couple as working there, so I would have seen some pre-game entertainment. Just obviously, you've been to a few grand final pre-game entertainments, Nathan, and a few grand finals in general. Just the top four grand final entertainments I've got here. You can agree or disagree to this one based off your music sense, Nathan. But yeah, I reckon that the Killers' performance was definitely a special one. They definitely rocked it pre and post game, and the iconic Jack Revolt coming on stage to sing along with the Killers was definitely a memorable one. Got Kiss there, Pies Lines. You would have seen that one live in the flesh, Nathan. I think that was more of a nostalgic one. They rocked their house there. Katy Perry was actually not too bad seeing her live as well. Definitely one that was quite impressive in general. And then Hunters and Collectors back in 2013, Hawks and versus Freo. Very iconic. A band that played a very iconic song as well that is very reminiscent of AFL. What are your thoughts on the pre-game entertainment, Nathan? And what is your kind of best that you've seen live, having been to a few grand finals yourself?
Yeah, I reckon Robbie Williams from 22 is pretty stiff.
Oh, yeah.
I thought he was really good in 22. To be honest with you, I'm not a big music fan. I haven't really gone to the grand finals for the music. It's sort of just been a bit of an added bonus. But yes, 2017, I definitely think will stand out. For a lot of people, just Chris last year I thought were really good. Katy Perry on Saturday, I thought she was really good. And I don't even remember Hunters and Collectors, so I can't even comment on that. In fact, I think I might have even been at the show that year watching that grand final. But yeah, I think Robbie Williams is stiff to miss out on this list. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, I think if we're the less said about Meatloaf back in 29, I think whenever he played
2011.
Yeah, that's right. When St Kilda, when Geelong and
Collingwood
played off. I remember seeing some footage, and I remember seeing a few interviews from the players basically saying they went out and had a bit of a laugh and went back in and said, "Yeah, not today." But that's all we got time for, and hopefully you enjoyed the grand final, regardless of where you watched it from. As I said, we'll move into a wash up of all the clubs that we haven't touched on. I know we've touched on a few. Go check those out on our channel if you haven't already, with some other great content creators that we discussed kind of the review of it, or when we did it back then, it was basically a mid-year preview, but now the season's done and dusted. We'll be looking at the season as a whole and basically tying in the trade period as well. Obviously, depending on when we release those videos, will dictate what players have actually been traded in and out, but we'll discuss those as they've been completed. So whether or not they're pending or they're completed will be yet to be seen. But we'll give our thoughts on that, and then hopefully that'll give you some ammunition to move into the 2025 Supercoach season, and hopefully you've got a pool of players there, regardless if they've traded in or not, to build your side for next year. But other than that, hopefully you had a great grand final day, and we'll catch you for the next one.